the property price fallacy that will fundamentally shock Australia. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of people. Hello, John.
Hi, mate. How you going?
Pretty good. How are you?
Pretty good.
So, interesting conversation today about how much prices around the country are going up or not.
Indeed. Look, so I think today is a very interesting show. We have, we're potentially on the verge of, I think, revealing a potential scandal. We won't call it a scandal yet, but a potential scandal. So we have been led to believe, and just going back to our last show, we even conceded this point that in the last quarter, or the first 3 months of the financial year, house prices in Sydney and Melbourne have been going up. And basically a whole host of vested interests have been pushing this single narrative that there is a recovery underway. Now, the really interesting point about this is that you interviewed the chief economist from REA Group, Nerida Consby, who basically came out with you, but also with a subsequent interview with Peter Switzer, and said they're not seeing that recovery. And that, to me, was a fundamental shock to me to say, hey, I thought the market in Sydney, Melbourne going up. Now she's saying it's not going up. What's going on? And obviously, subsequent to that, you and I have looked at your data set, and we found results very similar to what REA Group has said. And so obviously, we're here to discuss in the first half, and we're going to interview Edwin in the second half, Edwin Almeida, about have house prices gone up, or have they actually been falling, and has the entire country been led to believe in a fallacy and a hoax that never actually existed?
Yeah, and to be fair to Nerida, she did say, there is evidence in some places of prices going up, particularly at the top end of the market, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, and I agree with that. But if you take the average across the whole of the region, there's a very different story, and it doesn't seem to me to chime very well with some of the other information that's publicly available.
Indeed. So so before we get into going into in terms of what REA Group has sort of said, via your show and via Switcher's show, so who has led this fallacy? Or who has led this belief that the property market has been going up? So obviously, when you think about, the politicians have been talking about property price recovery, economic institutions like the RBA, and even say the ABS, obviously the mainstream media, property commentators, property research groups, and there's a whole host of them that we can name. Economic consulting houses, Deloitte Access Economics, basically came out in the past few days and said that Sydney house prices are rising $3,000 a week, and Melbourne house prices are rising $2,500 a week. Now, just on that point, I've actually emailed the relevant partners at Deloitte Access Economics and said, what's the basis for your claim? I haven't received an email back, so I'll wait to see if they are willing to tell me their source for that particular claim. Obviously, you've got the property sector and you've got the banks and the bank economists. So this is all these people saying that property prices are going up steeply in Sydney and Melbourne. Obviously, my nemesis, Christopher Joy, has been saying that he has been vindicated by this single narrative push. Now, where this is all coming from? It's coming from CoreLogic. So CoreLogic, and we'll talk a little bit about CoreLogic today, their property price index on a quarter-by-quarter basis, is the main source of data that everyone has been relying on to say that the property market has been going up. And so we'll just put the so I took a snapshot on the 6th of October, which is just like 1 week into the second quarter, but it gives us a nice snapshot of the last 3 months. So just looking on a quarter-by-quarter basis, CoreLogic said that Sydney house prices went up 3.82% for the quarter, Melbourne went up 3.67%, and Brisbane went up 0.76. So these are effectively the numbers. And obviously, I thought we would include Brisbane in this conversation because we have some interesting things to say about Brisbane as well. But the whole narrative, the whole belief that there is a recovery and that there is a boom now in Sydney and Melbourne house prices in particular has been based on CoreLogic and these hedonic indexes, whether they're daily, quarterly or yearly indexes. And obviously there is now people on the record saying, no, we don't believe in this. And this is fundamentally important because every single piece of information that people generally receive, whether it's through, particularly through the TV, through the radio, through print media, it's all based on a single source of information. And now there's a legitimate question as to how accurate is that source of information.
Yes, and the hedonic index is meant to be one of the most sophisticated indices in the world for property, and it's meant to pull in information from lots of different sources, and it tries to actually not just look at transactional data on properties for sale, but the whole portfolio all the time. That's the fundamental basis on which their indices are predicated, right? Except that there are some interesting observations in terms of, well, is that completely the whole story, or what's really going on with the index? And frankly, it's not clear to me precisely what's going on.
Indeed. So why don't we sort of set up this conversation by going to the person who I thought started this potential scandal in my mind, which was REA Group. And so a couple of weeks ago, you interviewed Nerida Consby on Walk the World, and there was a particular clip in which she said that they're not seeing a recovery in house and Sydney and Melbourne house prices. And she said actually in your interview that no, that prices are still falling. So prices didn't go up, prices are still falling. Because I listened to the clip this morning before I came here. So this is what she said. So why don't we actually play her key statement on your show, just so the audience can get that they can get an understanding of what REA Group is saying on the record.
Okay, so that sales data interests me because obviously with the low volumes that are currently going through in terms of auction clearance rates and transaction throughput, the price data appears to be quite strong. I guess my question is that true, or is it actually a function of the more limited volumes and therefore the limited data streams that are coming through?
Oh, absolutely, the volumes has a lot to do with that at the moment. I mean, we're not seeing growth in Melbourne and Sydney as yet. So I think some forecast or some creators of indices that are seeing strong growth in Melbourne and Sydney at the moment. We're not. We are still seeing price declines, but we are seeing some suburbs do very, very well. And the suburbs that are doing well tend to be premium suburbs. It's premium Sydney in particular. We are seeing strong growth in places like Vaucluse and Collaroy and Rose Bay, for example. Some strong growth in Gold Coast premium, which I think is related to Sydney money. We can certainly see search moving from Sydney up to the Gold Coast. So premium markets are doing pretty well. It is pretty... auction clearance rates, that's another one that tends to be a little bit misleading because if you have a look at auction numbers and where auctions take place, they are mainly in Sydney and Melbourne, and they're mainly Sydney and Melbourne premium. So, we've got these very high auction clearance rates, but at the same time, if you have a look at a market like Sydney, listing volumes are down 25% compared to the same time last year. So there's a distinct lack of property on the market, which, is one of the key drivers of price growth.
And it's worth saying, John, that I didn't in any way pre-position that question, right? In fact, I expected her to say prices were going up, right? So I reacted, hopefully with a fairly straight face, but I thought that was a really telling conversation point.
Yes, and the thing that really jumped out at my mind was when she said that her organisation, their findings, that they're not seeing what the quote creators of price indices are saying. Well, she didn't say CoreLogic, and obviously to be fair, CoreLogic is not the only creator of price indices, but the main one that has been saying that there is a recovery in house prices is CoreLogic, and she said. At her group, and obviously REA Group owns realestate.com, which is a big source of information about what is happening in the market. They are seeing prices still falling in Melbourne, Sydney, not rising, and that is a big controversy purely because the entire country has been led to believe a narrative based on one organisation's data.
Yes, and look, let's be honest. Any average is always going to be misleading, right? Because averages, by definition, are always going to be inaccurate. But it was very significant that her position is quite different from the publicly held view by most people, I think, in Australia as to what's happened in the last 3 months.
Indeed. And so, I mean, when I watched your interview with her, I was so shocked with her statement that what I went off and did was I actually emailed Peter Switzer and Christopher Joy And basically, because Christopher Joy for the last few months has been saying that Keane and Adams have been fundamentally wrong. There is a recovery. They didn't understand they don't understand economics. They don't understand the market. And you know, because Christopher Joy has forecasted that property prices will go up 5 to 10% over the next 12 months. And I think in a recent debate with Steve Keane, he said after the second rate cut, which was July, so from July of 2019 to July of 2020, Christopher Joy said prices will rise 10%, and he said prices have already gone up 3-4%. And this is where's this claim coming from? It's coming from CoreLogic, and so he always says, I always call it right. This is the big claim by Mr. Joy, and yet and he's already starting to push that narrative, and so we have REA Group on the record of saying, well, this whole narrative by Christopher Joy and others is basically wrong in their view. The data doesn't support that. So this is why I emailed your interview with Nerida to Switzer and Joy. And resulting from that, Switzer decided to have Nerida on his program to basically get to the bottom of, well, the comments she made on your show, and you know, I was interested to see what she would say, and she basically didn't walk away from her position. She basically said, no, I mean, you know, prices, particularly in Sydney, on an annualized basis, are still falling, and she said that, you know, they have their own data scientists internally. They have their own data warehouse. They're actually got their own internal price indices, and their own work is showing something fundamentally different to what CoreLogic and other spruikers have been saying. And so, why don't we actually play this key clip from the Switzer interview?
When John Adams actually put this out, and I will name John because he actually did say that. He said that you've virtually said that CoreLogic's data about a house price rebound is bullshit. And I could imagine you using the word, but I could imagine John using the word. But I could imagine you might have questioned some aspects of it, but you wouldn't have been doubting that the house prices are starting to move up.
I certainly didn't use the word bullshit.
Yeah.
Good
girl. Your mum going to be proud of you.
Not a common word for me, but I guess what we're seeing is definitely a recovery.
Yep.
But at the moment, it's not spreading across Sydney as a whole. It's not spreading across Melbourne as a whole. So,
but is that unusual? Because even when there's a big house price boom, some suburbs go up by large amounts and some go up by little amounts. Isn't that true?
Yeah, and that's exactly what's happening. If we have a look at what's happening, it's a premium market story. If you have a look at Sydney's premium suburbs, you've got Vaucluse going up 20%, you've got Rose Bay up 12%. Go to Parramatta and try and find an apartment that's gone up in value. You're probably going to find it a little bit harder to find one.
But you've been sneaky there. And it's unusual because you work in newspapers. How could you be sneaky? Or you're related to newspapers. Because you said houses in Vaucluse and apartments in Parramatta. What are houses in Parramatta doing? Are they better than apartments?
Better than apartments. Yeah. So I guess what we're finding is when we look at our index on a year-on-year basis, Sydney as a whole is still going backwards.
Oh, really?
Sydney premium is doing very well, but it's yet to spread to medium-priced suburbs. It's not spreading to apartments. The recovery is underway, but it just takes time.
Well, that's pretty definitive, isn't it? Although, of course, she's talking about annual price movements. And even CoreLogic would probably say that, prices were down, they're now going up. So we've got to be careful about the time frame differences. But nevertheless, I think it's pretty telling.
Yes. So in the interview with Switzer, she said on an annualised basis. But in your interview, she said, no, prices in Melbourne and Sydney are still falling. So that would obviously indicate to me that, when you're looking at Sydney and Melbourne as a whole, we are not seeing like a robust recovery, because she said, like other price indexes, we're not seeing a recovery to the extent that these other indexes are suggesting. Yep. And so, I mean, obviously, I think her comments are fundamentally significant because people are out there in the marketplace either selling property or buying property thinking that prices are recovering, particularly if you want to buy a property and you think, prices are booming at now, I need to get in now so that I don't miss out, because otherwise if I wait 6 months down the track, it may be more expensive. And yet if people have made decisions in the last 3 months, or people are planning to make decisions in the next 4 to 8 weeks, it could be based on a completely fallacious price proposition that's not supported by independent data.
Yeah, and again, prices will be varying by different types of property in different locations and all those things. But nevertheless, it fundamentally changes the zeitgeist around property. That's the key point, I think.
So before we get into looking into your data, so you and I have compiled some data. We've compiled some data over the last week in order to get a sense as to who's more accurate between CoreLogic and an REA Group. Using your model and your methodology and your data sources. I think it's important just to explain to the audience about how important CoreLogic is to how a whole host of vested interest groups around the country talk about property prices. I like to talk about there's a massive reliance on CoreLogic. I like to talk about it in terms of it being a tangled web of vested interests are using this one data source. So I've drawn this diagram. I'm just going to put it up on the screen. And basically what I want to show is there's a whole group of people who are using this one organization's data to push this narrative from federal state politicians, from the RBA, from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And the ABS is important because the house price index for the ABS is solely based on CoreLogic data, and we're going to actually quote that. But you've got the banks, you've got the mortgage brokers, superannuation funds, academics, researchers, media, property sector, prospective buyers and owners of property, and obviously investment banks and hedge funds. Everyone is to a large extent basing their assessment of the market purely on this one organization's data, and the key question is that if this data and the index is correct, well then everyone has an accurate view of the market. If it's not correct, well then everyone can be led to believe into something that isn't actually happening, and that to me. So obviously, when you have different economists or economic houses, you can come up with different estimates for different things. But I think what the scandal is not necessarily that there's a dispute about what's happened in the market. I think the more scandal is that everyone is relying on one data source, and if that data source is wrong, everyone has been led to believe something that never actually existed.
Yeah, and it's worth saying that CoreLogic is a reputable company. It's got a footprint overseas as well as here in Australia. It's got big international backers, so it's well financed, and they invest big in their data services and systems. So we're not necessarily saying that they are wrong versus somebody else is right. But what we are saying is they are fundamentally wired into the way that people think about property in Australia. And if for any reason their index was a little bit off, that could have a significant impact on people's perceptions of what's going on.
Precisely. So I mean, I just want to go to a second to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So their residential property price indexes. I'm going to quote their concept, sources, and methods. So this is the data source quote paragraph 7.15. A quote: all Australian residential property price sales data are supplied to the ABS by CoreLogic. The data is a combination of residential property sales data obtained from state and territory land title office or valuers, general offices in each capital city, and real estate agents data provided to CoreLogic. The ABS applies classifications to this data set to create the residential property sales data set from which the price indexes and related statistics are produced. So here's the thing. So even the official statistics are solely based on this one organization's data. And now and obviously, because obviously people can say, well, spruikers may say X, but we have the official data of the government. Well, the official data of the government is the same data set that the spruikers are pushing. And so the important point is that if there's now controversy about the accuracy of this data, there has to be a fundamental rethink as to, well, how should government statistics be compiled, but also how should people make a genuine assessment about the market?
It's worth saying again that CoreLogic has multiple indices, right? But they've acquired other data companies like Residex, for example, right? So they don't have just this hedonic one. They have various other ones as well that are working. So they are multiple sourced in terms of their information sets. However, there's a timing question, right? Because a lot of the official information from the valuer generals are at least 3 months behind, simply because that's the way that the transfer processes work and the data flows through. So the critical question, John, is what happens in those 3 months between the official data coming out and essentially the day-by-day reporting of the index, right? That's where there's an interesting question, because then the question is, well, what information flows do they get hold of, and how is it interpreted, and how is it actually mapped into the data? And we don't know, because that is not publicly disclosed.
Yes. So now the key question for people to say is that so if the market has been misled to believe a fallacy, if this recovery never happened, which we're going to reveal with your data, you're saying it didn't happen,
Yet.
it hasn't happened yet, and REA Group is saying they can't see it happening. So the question is, well, how and why could CoreLogic be wrong? So I mean, really, and so I make no claims about, so if they are wrong, I make no claims as to why they're wrong. But in theory, there's basically three reasons in my mind. One is either the methodology that they use to calculate the indexes is flawed. The quality of the data they're using to put into the indexes, that's poor or incomplete, or there could be some deliberate manipulation in terms of the index. So one of those three things I think could be at play, and so there's, I think, a few points to make on that.
Or John, it could be that they are ahead of the curve, and everybody else's index will catch up once the other data comes through. That is a legitimate point, even if you might not actually believe that is the most obvious one. We should put it on the table too.
Well, but the thing is that, here's the thing. So when you say they're ahead of the curve, they've already made a claim about the last 3 months, like the first 3 months of the financial year.
Yep.
And the data for that first 3 months, if the authoritative source is the valuer general, well, no one has access to that data yet because it's still being compiled. So obviously there is some basis for them to make a claim. So I'm not sure if we can be categorical to say they're ahead of the curve, because there's no basis to be ahead of the curve.
No. But my point is, if they've got data flows from legitimate sources, which nobody else has, they could potentially be ahead of the curve, and in 3 months' time, everybody will say, no, you were right? That is certainly a feasible outcome.
Sure.
But the question is that going to be the outcome? We don't know yet.
Well, we don't know, and obviously we're going to go through your data. We're going to go through REA's sort of statements as well.
Yep.
So a few points to make on this. Now, in terms of the methodology of CoreLogic, who created this? Christopher Joy, the person who I debated back in March, and so he wrote an article from September 2016 for the AFR, where he talked about the work that he did in developing in terms of these indexes. So I'm just going to quote from this article, which is titled "The RBA Gets Housing Wrong Again." Quote, this is Christopher Joy writing, quote, in the mid-2000s, the RBA was worried about the timelessness and accuracy of the quarterly median price indices. To address these problems, I helped establish a business that designed the daily hedonic house price index CoreLogic publishes, which we built in close consultation with the RBA.
Yeah, and it's also we'll just put up the longer quote that he also included, right? Because he goes into quite a lot of detail there about the mechanisms that are used within the index.
So obviously, look, if there's an issue with the index and the methodology, it goes back to the person who designed it. That is Christopher Joy, Mr. Property Spruiker himself, who says there's going to be a recovery in the house price and house prices for over the next 12 months, from July 2019 to July 2020. So that's one potential area of sort of concern. Or potential problem, and then obviously in terms of data flows, so obviously you and Edwin, who'll bring in on a second, have more information about this than I do. But correct me if I'm wrong. So CoreLogic used to get a rich data flow from.
So something changed 4 months ago. It's to do with HomeTrack. HomeTrack was a very rich source of real estate-led information from the real estate agencies, right? And that information would have flowed into CoreLogic's systems. However, about 4 months ago, that then got diverted to REA. Mm-hmm. So effectively, CoreLogic lost a very significant data source in their overall systems and processes, right? And when we talk to Edwin, we'll ask him about the consequences of that, because he was saying even 6 months, 12 months ago, that he's got a concern about the accuracy of the CoreLogic data now without the home track data.
Yep. So obviously there has been so when REA makes their claims, they are basing on this home track data because they've acquired that company, and that data used to go to CoreLogic, and they're no longer getting it anymore. So we don't know to what extent that has actually impacted the accuracy of these indexes.
And the timing's interesting because, of course, the CoreLogic index started to take off quite soon after that transfer of data was affected.
Okay. So the potential could be a relationship there.
I don't know. I'm just making a correlation. I don't know whether it's correct or not. I'm just saying, from a timing perspective, I think it's quite interesting.
Interesting. Okay, so now what I want to do with the conversation is to go into the, in terms of what we've done, particularly in terms of your index. So I asked you. So you don't typically do this, but what I said to you is, could you calculate a sort of general price estimation for all of Sydney, all of Melbourne, all of Brisbane, and then come back to me with these numbers, so we can sort of see to what extent is your data reflecting either CoreLogic or in terms of REA, and so basically you ran your model, and you came back to me with a 3-month rolling average for those 3 capital cities. And you gave it to me in quartiles, like in an upper quartile, lower quartile, and the middle 50%. And so I've done some manipulation with that, and we've talked about how that was going to be done. And so what we're going to put up on the screen now is what we found in terms of what your data is saying for Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane for the first quarter of the financial year. So according to your data, you've said that house prices went up 0.56 for Sydney, 0.13 for Melbourne, and 0.27 for Brisbane. But for units, they saw heavy falls, 3.5% falls in Sydney, a fall of 1.92% in Melbourne, and a fall of 1.65 in Brisbane. So obviously these numbers that you've looked at for these capital cities, they are very different to particularly for Sydney, Melbourne, to a whole of market 3.8%, 3.7% increase in Melbourne, Sydney. So before we go any further, do you want to sort of give a bit of a flavour to the audience as to how did you come up with these sort of in terms of these estimates for these capital cities using your data and methodology?
Yeah, so that's the core market model that essentially we've been running for years and years, and we populate that from a number of information flows that come in, including our surveys, including other data sources, and that includes some price transaction information. So this is more to do with what's happened in terms of prices that are actually transacted in the last few months. And we then actually take account of the characteristics of those properties and then read that across to the rest of the property base that we've got and the values that we have. So that's the way we've done it. Not perfect by any means, but it's a reasonable estimate in my view. I haven't tried to publish this on a regular basis because it's quite new and we're just sort of seeing how it goes. But it is, I think, quite a revealing sort of story. But we have this down at a very granular level too, and it's the granularity that really tells the story, because there are areas where prices have gone up and there are areas where prices have gone down.
Indeed. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go through Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane separately, and we're going to look at the various quartiles as you sent me the original data, just to give people a flavour, is because this is your data is very consistent with what REA Group said, which was that the premium suburbs are the ones that are seeing a bit of a price recovery, but the broader housing market is still falling. So when we go and have a look at Sydney, for example, what we see is that in the top quartile, the top 25% of all properties or houses in Sydney have gone up 2%. The middle 50% only went up 0.2%, and the bottom quartile was still falling in Sydney. Whereas when you look at units, still heavy falls for units across the board, but the falls in the top quartile were less than the bottom quartile. So obviously, so that's obviously a very consistent sort of thing that the REA Group is saying, because they've been saying that in premium suburbs like Vaucluse, we are seeing sort of robust growth. But even in we'll put up on the screen, Domain.com.au today said that prices in sort of Western and Southwest Sydney are still falling. So that obviously gives you so a Domain, what Domain is saying, what REA Group is saying, and what your data is saying is a very consistent story about certain pockets are going up, but the broader market is still falling.
Yeah. And as more data points come in, we'll know more for certain. But certainly there is a difference of view relative to what the CoreLogic story was.
Yes. Now, in terms of Melbourne, so let's go to Melbourne. So, again, your data, you're saying that for the top quartile for houses, it went up 3.3%, which was quite robust. The middle 50% went up only 0.8, and the bottom quartile only went up 0.3. Obviously, a different story for units. Actually, the top quartile for units in Melbourne actually went up for the quarter, 0.1%, which is effectively flat. The middle 50% fell 2.5%, and the bottom quartile fell 2.8%. So Melbourne, a slightly better story on property prices compared to Sydney, but still, fair to say, nothing like the 3.7% of whole of market, which is what CoreLogic was roughly saying for the quarter. And then obviously when we go and have a look at Brisbane, in terms of Brisbane, the top quartile for houses went up 1.9%. The middle quartile actually fell, or the middle 50% actually fell 0.3%. The bottom quartile fell 0.2% for houses. And then obviously for units, the top quartile went up 1% in Brisbane. The middle 50% fell 2.5%, and the bottom quartile fell 2.6%. So obviously, again, we're seeing a premium story in Brisbane, but the broader market is seeing weakness both in houses and units.
Yeah, and it's worth just saying I prescribe my geographic footprints based on the postcodes. That's how I've done it, just so people are clear.
Yeah. Now, so what we can say now is, so we're seeing that there is a lot of weakness in units. And I think a lot of that would have been around some of the construction scandals that we are seeing.
Yep.
People have lost confidence in that particular market, but also there's probably a lot of supply also coming on the market. And when you look at credit growth numbers, we're seeing that there's not a lot of a lot of new borrowing for units. So there's a bit of a credit story as well as a construction quality story there. But we're seeing massive weakness there, and we're seeing some strength in housing and houses, but nowhere near the extent that has been reported on by either the index, CoreLogic index, or by the mainstream media. So what I decided to do when I looked at this sort of data is to just come up with a very basic weighted average, so that we could come up with a rough number. So that we could actually, give the audience a bit of a price comparison between DFA and CoreLogic. So one of the questions I asked you, Martin, was, what would a rough split of the Sydney market be between houses and units for Melbourne and Sydney? And what you said to me was that, you think that it's fair to say that 65% of the Sydney market is houses, 35% is units, the same for Melbourne. And for Brisbane, you said to me that 70% of the market is probably houses and 30% is units. So taking a very basic weighted average of that description, I basically came up with some numbers for the first quarter of the financial year. And so DFA is saying that Sydney prices fell by 0.43% for the quarter. Melbourne went up 0.09%, and Brisbane fell 0.15% compared to the CoreLogic numbers. And obviously what I did was, now I took a snapshot on the 6th of October, which only goes back to the 6th of July. So it's not we're only 1 week out in terms of what the actual numbers are, but it's still fairly on the money. But obviously, CoreLogic is saying 3.82% for Sydney, Melbourne up 0.367% for Melbourne, and 0.67% for Brisbane. So a very big difference between what CoreLogic is saying, which the mainstream media, the property sector, the banks, the government, the ABS is all basing on, and what you've now said. And obviously, REA has said something very similar on the record to what your numbers reveal. So obviously, with your numbers looking very different to CoreLogic, what do you have to say to the audience?
Well, I'm saying it's early days, but there is an interesting correlation between my perspective and some of the other players that have been talking more recently about this. And maybe that means that we should just be asking a few more questions about what's really going on with home prices. We'll know ahead of time later on, but perhaps we should not be misled that prices are really bouncing back quickly.
Yeah. So what I think would be appropriate now is to actually, cut across to interview Edwin Almeida, because particularly when we talk about the Sydney market, I mean, we have a real estate agent of 20 years experience who's actually in the market. He's actually dealing with property, dealing with clients. He's got a network right across the Sydney basin, and obviously he can give us an anecdotal on the ground perspective of what is he seeing in the market. Is it something closer to your numbers and REA Group, or is it something closer to CoreLogic? So let's bring him on.
Yeah. Okay. Right. We'll do that. So Edwin, welcome to the show, and thank you for spending some time with us. You are the man on the ground, so we really want to pick your brains with regard to what's happening with regard to property prices.
Well, it's a pleasure to be there and to be here with you guys. I'm not there in person, because otherwise Uppercut Adams would get a slap across across the cheeks. I don't know, maybe we can start a fight or something.
Do that later, Edwin. We've got a few questions for you, and I'll let John run off with the first question.
Sure. Okay, mates. So one of the big, the whole basis of this show, one of the big bases is REA Group. Their chief economist came out in 2 interviews in the last fortnight. One was with Martin, the other one was with Peter Switzer, and basically said that according to REA, there is no evidence of a property price, like a robust property price recovery in Sydney, Melbourne. Like what she said, like creators of price indices have been claiming, and obviously who's been saying this in loud amount is CoreLogic. So obviously from your perspective, particularly being in the Sydney market, how significant do you think her comments were on the public record?
Well, I think her comments were very, very significant, highly significant, to say the least. And I was actually quite surprised that she didn't buckle under the pressure and the moves that Switzer was making on her. For a minute there, I thought he was going to go in for a peck. It was just one of those weird moments in that interview. But I thought she was. I thought that what she said was very, very significant, and it paints a clearer picture as what we've been saying all along. What I've been saying, that the hedonic daily index is BS, and you got to really take it with a grain of salt. And unless you understand how it's all put together, and unless you've got access to the back end, like a lot of real estate agents do have access to a lot of back end of these data houses, or the property portals and CoreLogic and the like, you're not really going to understand how the values are measured. And quite frankly, I don't even think the creators of the hedonic daily BS index understand how it all works anyway.
Okay, Edwin. So before we go on to the next question, so what do you think the implications are? So if the whole market has been led to believe there's a recovery based on one organisation's index, and now someone significant in the market is saying no, we disagree with that, what are the implications, do you think, of this controversy that's been now created?
Well, I've said it along. You've got to look at the source. You've got to look at the nature and the source of the data. I've said for many years, for decades, I've been saying that REA, or as most of the people know, realestate.com.au have the richest form of data out there. They've got all the data. We upload a lot of data on the back end when we list properties for sale. We upload more data on the back end when properties are sold. Properties don't get taken off the portal as sold or otherwise unless specific data is populated or is inputted on the back end, so that the listings can go live, or the listings can come off and inform the general public. So that is very, very rich data, and I dare say that 85 to 90% real estate agents at best would use Domain as well. The majority of the industry use REA or realestate.com to list properties. It's the biggest portal, it's the biggest source, it's the richest, and CoreLogic, SQM, and a lot of these other second tier, third tier data companies are basically either scraping off the front end or have got financial agreements with data houses to obtain the data. And as you know, John and Martin, I've been saying since last year that the relationship between CoreLogic and REA is severed now, because REA have got their own data house. They've spent hundreds of millions of dollars, and they're going to start more than likely start selling the data directly to the open market and to financial institutions, because that is the purest or the richest form of data that I'm aware of. There's nothing else better, in my opinion, than the REA data.
Sure. Okay. So now, one of the things just before we had you on, Edwin, is we went through Martin's own price estimates for Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane, and we obviously compared that to CoreLogic for the first 3 months of the financial year, from July to September. Now, CoreLogic is basically saying that the market went up for Sydney around 3.8% for the first quarter. Now, whereas Martin's data saying is that no, Sydney actually fell by 0.43%. So one is saying it went up 3.8%, the other one is saying it actually fell 0.43%. So, and obviously, you may have heard that Deloitte Access Economics in the last few days have said that Sydney property prices are actually going up by $3,000 a week. And I've been chasing them to find out what's the basis of that claim. But obviously, you are a real estate agent in the Sydney market. You are dealing with clients. You've got your network right across the city. What's your professional assessment of the market over the last 3 months? Has the market gone up about nearly 3 to 3.8%, or has the market as a whole, do you think, has been falling, similar to what Martin's data has been saying, but also what REA Group said on the record as well?
Well, yeah, I was speaking with my next door neighbour earlier today, and she said to me that her property's gone up in value by 4%. And I said, "And so where do you get that information from, or who's told you that? The local agent or what?" And said, "No, I heard it on the news." And I've been hearing it on television. It's just the banter and the rhetoric that the mainstream have been propagating. But I think we've got to listen very carefully to what Nerida Conisbee said in the interview with both Martin and Peter and Twitzer. She was very, very clear. She was very clear in her in what she said, in the statements that she made, and I think they're very critical statements. And that was that only pockets or certain areas of Sydney and Melbourne, which were the high-end areas that have gone up in value significantly, by about 10 or so percent, in some cases more. Now, but the rest of Sydney and the rest of Melbourne have really gone. They're still recording falls, and that data, as I said, is because that is live. That is what real estate agents put on the back end on a day-to-day basis as properties get sold and the information gets updated. So that was a very, very significant statement that you made. So I also liken this whole thing that we're hearing with regards to the CoreLogic and everybody else that uses the CoreLogic data and the hedonic index in order to justify the property values going up. So, I heard a story that there was 5 people in an elevator going in. We're in an elevator, and the net worth of all the individuals was, on average, in the hundreds, and possibly, within $1 million. That was the net worth of the individuals. And on the 3rd floor, in walked, Warren Buffett. And now, so what's the average net worth of that group of people now? That's how I feel that a lot of this data that's been compiled of recent months has a similar view. I know it's an exaggerated one, but understandably, a lot of the properties in the market that are being sold and that are being transacted have been high-end properties. And the other significant factor is that, in a lot of areas and in a lot of, I'm not not that up to date with Melbourne, but I know in Sydney we're running close to 50%, of the perhaps even higher reduction in actual transactions than what we were in previous years. So when on average New South Wales is running at when New South Wales is on average is being transacting 1,300 properties a week, what do you expect? The numbers are very low. So and if the numbers that make up those sales transactions are very low and are in the high bracket range or in the in the high, you're going to get a huge distortion of the median or the so-called rises or the averages of the median, because it's lumping everything into one pot. The other thing is what they don't tell you is the fact that in a lot of these areas and in the high-end areas, if you recall, some of these areas fell by up to 35% from their highs. So having a rise of 10% is really not a recovery, is it?
Good point. Yeah, when it depends over the time frame that you're looking. But what do you think then? Do you think that there's really a false narrative or a bit of a hoax out there in terms of what people are thinking about property?
I think so, and I think we've got to go back to the basics, and what Nerida said once again just solidified what you and I have been talking for almost a year, Martin, and which is in relation to the gravity or the falls in numbers in actual sales transactions. You get the mainstream media just pushing one story. What one person's experience doesn't necessarily make a national story, and that is what in a lot of the cases. I think some of the domain writers should just stick to the fluffy pillow stories and what colour they should paint the kitchen before the property goes up for sale, rather than trying to become economists. I mean, some of the stuff that comes out based on somebody's experience, just because some goose paid 15-20% over the reserve, doesn't mean that everybody's going to be paying 15-20% over the reserve on all the other auctions in the Sydney or Melbourne region. It just a simple fact is that there's always one goose in every 100. So and that's the one that they managed to interview. There's a lot of discrepancy, and the discrepancy has been bolstered or is magnified because of the fact of the low volumes. That's what the mainstream media should be talking about. They should be talking about the fact that all these figures, all this rhetoric, all this narrative of rises and this restoration of this positive upbeat, rather than informing the people what's really happening, is all based on very low volumes that is absolutely crippling the real estate industry in itself. Well, it wouldn't surprise me if the real estate industry itself becomes the straw that breaks the camel's back and it sinks the property market further early next year.
So finally, Edwin, there are lots of different contradictory stories then out there about property prices going up, not going up. So what would your advice to be to an individual punter trying to get a handle on property prices in a local area? What's the best source? Look,
a lot of the people, a lot of family, friends, and people that aren't in the industry that I talk to, they all tell me, if you go to the front end of Domain and the property portals, they give you a predictive view on what the price of a house is or the area and all this sort of stuff. All that's really not working, because it's subjective to whatever data is putting on there and then whatever they want to release and whatever they want to publish. As I always said, Martin, it's all about research, and when you think you've researched enough, research again. There's a lot of different sources. You can subscribe. Look, I'm not saying that CoreLogic is totally bad. I just think that parts of it, in terms of the hedonic daily index and things like that, are very questionable, to say the least. But the actual data pool, the historical data pool that they have, that myself and my colleagues rely on in order to get an idea, a perspective of what's happening in certain areas, That's also very, it's very good. It's very rich, which people can also, the general public can access that or parts of it by paying a once-off fee or a small subscription for a short period of time. Then obviously I always say, look, as much as real estate agents we get bagged or we get hassled, but there's still a lot of great real estate agents out there in the industry, and I just say, talk to them. Get to know them. Get to know the older agents that have been in those areas, in those suburbs that have got a rich history with that community or that suburb. Not necessarily the community, because communities have become rather big and transient, but they understand what's happened with the actual area. So they are a source. And I'm not saying you go there and you buy, or you just go to one agent. Go to multiple agents. Get feedback. You've just got to pull it all together, Martin, and then just sift through all the BS, and then understand, and then you get to the bottom of it. But even if you're not going to do that, go to realestate.com.au and it shows you historical sales on the front end, which a lot of data houses rely on a lot of that anyway by scraping the data off the front end. So you can get some information from that. But I always say there are a lot more sources, and you just got to be prepared to. It's a huge investment. It's the biggest investment that you're going to make in your life. Other than Uppercut Adams getting into the ring with me, and I mean that's going to could take out his life altogether. But we'll see what happens at the end of the year. But other than that, for everybody else, buying a principal place of residence or a big investment, or an investment is the biggest investment that they're going to make in their life.
Yeah, Edwin, I really appreciate your time today, and I think your advice is dead right, which is go local, do research, don't just take those high-level headlines that everybody keeps repeating, because property prices do vary. Thank you very much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Oh, look, I appreciate you calling me, and any time, and Uppercut, we're on.
Okay, John, so we've gone through the data, we've gone through what Edwin's perspective is. What is your takeout from all this?
Sure. So Martin, so I think there's a few key points to make that the audience should walk away with. First one is there is no consensus on the movement of property prices. So we have certain organisations out there saying that property prices have gone up, and we have other organisations like REA and DFA saying that no, it's either been flat or it's actually been going down over the last sort of 3 months. So there is no uniform consensus. So that's point number one. Point number two is that people need to understand that when they hear information, they need to understand what the source of that information is. And so whether it's official government statistics or charts from the Reserve Bank of Australia or the mainstream media or certain property groups or the banks, etc., when they say property prices are going up and they've been going up robustly, including my nemesis Christopher Joy in the AFR, where's this all coming from? Is it from a variety of sources, or is it just one source? And the reality is that the entire country has been led to believe a proposition based on one source of data, which we have now revealed in this conversation that there is controversy about. And so obviously, the other thing that I thought took away from Edwin's comments was that when you asked him, do you believe that the public has been led to believe a hoax? He says, I do. So here we have some data saying that no, CoreLogic, there's a dispute about CoreLogic, but we have a real estate agent in the field who's saying he is not on the ground seeing the types of price rises across, across the market, because we can say that some parts of the market are going up, but when we're taking a broad view of the Sydney Basin, Edwin is saying he can't see the increases that CoreLogic claims, and he's seeing something similar to what you and REA is saying. So that's, I think, another piece of evidence that I think perhaps lend weight that this so-called recovery that has been claimed to have happened that is not happening at all. And obviously, if we go back to our last conversation about credit growth, the credit growth numbers would point to that, there's a lot of activity around refinancing, but in terms of new loans to drive the market up, that has been very lackluster. And obviously, we had the minutes from the RBA yesterday pointing to potential requirements for further easing because of slowness across the economy. Don't believe what this tangled web of what I call integrated propaganda is telling you, because there's sufficient evidence to either question it or to actually come out and say no, it's completely wrong, and that and that the economy is actually headed in the opposite direction and very similar to what we said in our last post compared to what the mainstream media and the mainstream economists are actually saying. And I think the third point is that, just to finish on the point that in terms of what Edwin says is, don't rely on one source of information to make the biggest either lifestyle choice or investment choice that you'll ever make. Do your research, rely on multiple sources of information, talk to multiple real estate agents, do your homework, and then obviously try to make the best decision you can, but using as much data as you can possibly obtain.
John, great advice. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. We'll see you next time.